Chapter 15 about Reconstruction wraps up our look at Period 5, which had been centered around the Civil War and the questions certainly here that it raised in its aftermath. So, Reconstruction is the period after the Civil War in which former Confederate states in the South were brought back into the United States or brought back into the Union. This meant federal or national government and Republican control of the South's affairs for years. And it also meant a dramatic, albeit temporary, expansion of rights for former slaves. Worth pointing out is that Southern resentment of this era is going to last well into the 20th century as they perceive these events and these policy changes very differently from their Northern and Republican counterparts, as we'll see. So, question one: what visions of freedom did the former slaves and slaveholders pursue in the post war South? So, African Americans experienced new freedoms in the immediate post war South. Keep in mind there are nearly 4 million newly freed people that now suddenly have freedom of movement. They are able to strengthen their family ties, they strengthen their community organizations like churches. Oftentimes, they sought education, oftentimes through a federal organization called the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Most pursued the vote, seeing suffrage as essential to their political freedom. And then finally, many tried to own land, which they saw as essential to their economic freedom. But keep in mind, these 4 million individuals, for the most part, the vast majority had absolutely no financial base, no financial foundation to build upon. So purchasing and owning land was a near impossibility for most of these 4 million folks. Also, in the aftermath of the war, some former white planters lost wealth, property, and really all whites felt that they had lost some degree of status after the emancipation of slaves because it eliminated that permanent underclass of African American slaves. So, in response to this, Southern whites really unite around the idea of trying to recreate a labor system and a society that adhered as closely as possible to slavery and the white supremacist society of the Old South. Republicans, on the other hand, wanted to establish a free labor system to replace slavery. And congressional Republicans used something called the Freedmen's Bureau to try to establish this. The Freedmen's Bureau was a federal organization that was designed, or rather, that was established to create schools in the South, to provide aid to the poor and to the elderly, to settle disputes between whites and African Americans and among African Americans themselves, and ultimately to secure equal treatment under the law for, again, 4 million newly freed slaves. This is a difficult task, to say the least. Plus, the Bureau is criticized as it reinforced stereotypes of dependence. So, the idea of African Americans being dependent on paternalistic slave owners. Well, here, this reinforces that idea by saying that African Americans cannot take care of themselves and thus have to be dependent on federal aid. You will still see people making similar racist arguments today in regard to various forms of government social assistance. Um, but attempts at land reform or land redistribution to try to give freed slaves a financial foundation and economic freedom to build on largely failed. Many freedmen or freed slaves ended up working, often for their former masters, as what were called sharecroppers. Keep in mind that cotton cultivation is still the South's primary economic activity, and exports are still extremely high. And despite the war, despite the end of slavery, the entire Southern economy really still revolves around the production of cotton on plantations. So, sharecropping is incredibly important to understanding the economic woes faced by Southern African Americans literally for generations hereafter. So, in a sharecropping arrangement, An African American family would rent some land on a plantation and they would cultivate cotton on it. Now, they didn't have any supplies or tools or anything else. Remember, they have no financial foundation. So in order to get supplies, they have to buy them from the planter, from the plantation owner, on credit, with the expectation they'll pay it back, obviously. At the end of a season, the sharecropper will pay half of his crop to the planter. So at the end of the season, no matter how much he has grown, half of it, about half of it's automatically going to go to the planter, the person that he rented the land from. So after paying his portion of the crop, paying rent, paying back loans for supplies like seeds, tools, etc., sharecroppers typically had very little left, or they found themselves just barely breaking even, or even finding themselves further into debt. And a lot of times, Southern state laws prevented sharecroppers from leaving the employment of a landowner as long as they still owed them money. And many, season after season, found themselves still indebted and stuck working for the folks who were oftentimes their former owners. So this keeps many African Americans trapped in a cycle of debt and poverty, sometimes for generations. And in a lot of respect, this is slavery, just slavery with a paycheck, or in a sense. Question number two, what were the sources, goals, and competing visions for Reconstruction? So remember the big question here, politically at least, is how do we deal with the defeated South? So we begin looking at Andrew Johnson's method, or Andrew Johnson's presidential Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson had been Lincoln's vice president and becomes president, obviously, when Lincoln is assassinated, and he is simply, from a modern perspective, not up to the task. He's a Southerner himself, and he's very sympathetic to most Southern white yeoman farmers, not necessarily the wealthy planters who he blames for having started the war, but his sympathy toward his fellow Southerners means that he thought Southern states should govern their own affairs and the federal government should be largely uninvolved. Plus, when it came to the question of black civil rights, Johnson held some very deeply racist views against them. Keep in mind, he is a Southerner from Tennessee himself. Johnson's policies during presidential Reconstruction are going to be considered to be too lenient toward the South by many radical Republicans in Congress. So, for example, Johnson offered a pardon to nearly all white Southerners who would take a loyalty oath, and that included politicians and certainly soldiers who had taken up arms against the United States. He also, again, largely allowed Southerners to manage their own affairs, which is very alarming because that meant it led to the election of former Confederate politicians and often led to violence and discrimination against African Americans. An example of this would be that many Southern states in the immediate aftermath of the war passed laws that were called black codes. Black codes regulated the lives of former slaves by limiting their freedom of movement, prohibiting them from voting, compelling them to work under conditions very similar to slavery oftentimes. So this is again a reflection of how Southerners are trying to recreate the white supremacist slave society in the post-Civil War American landscape. Um, so Johnson, being a Southerner, his sympathy toward white Southerners and his racist views toward African Americans led to policies that largely let the South govern itself, and that goes about as well as you would imagine. Now, radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens here oppose Johnson's Reconstruction policies, despite the fact that they are from the same party. They are all Republicans. Um, Radical Republicans sought to establish equal rights for all, regardless of race. Now, to try to do this, they will pass an extension or pass an expansion, I should say, of the Freedmen's Bureau. They're also going to pass something called the Civil Rights Bill, which would grant citizenship to anyone born in the United States and thus equal treatment under the law, regardless of what color they were. Now, both the expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill were vetoed by Johnson. So Johnson vetoes both of these, but amazingly, radicals in Congress managed to override President Johnson's veto of these. And that's a difficult thing to do. It takes more than a majority vote. It takes a supermajority in both houses, which is why Congress is rarely able to override a presidential veto. They simply can't muster the votes usually. It's hard enough to get a majority. To get a supermajority of 2/3 is insanely difficult. So this just shows the kind of unified opposition that Johnson is up against as the executive branch under Johnson and the legislative branch under radical Republicans vie for control of the Reconstruction process. Now, radicals will manage to pass and have ratified the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which basically did the same thing that the Civil Rights Bill was intended to do, but it enshrined it in the Constitution. So rather than simply being law, this is now part of our framework of government as a whole. The 14th Amendment made anyone born in the United States automatically a citizen and thus entitled to equal rights or civil rights under the law. Importantly, this invalidates the ruling in the Dred Scott decision that said that citizenship was limited to free white persons, that Dred Scott could not sue in federal court because he was not a citizen because he was black. So this invalidates that. It also effectively invalidates the 3/5 clause of the US Constitution that had counted African Americans as only 3/5 of a person. A major victory for radical Republicans is that they were able to pass the Reconstruction Acts. Again, Johnson will veto this, but they are amazingly able to muster enough votes to override that veto. So the Reconstruction Acts are passed in 1867, and this marks the beginning of what we call radical Reconstruction. And this is about a 10-year period between 1867 and 1877 that is characterized by congressional control over the Reconstruction process. So really, we've kind of shifted from presidential Reconstruction over to congressional Reconstruction, which is otherwise known as radical Reconstruction because it's radical Republicans that are in charge of Congress. So the Reconstruction Acts divided the South into 5 separate military districts that will be governed by martial law until they are able to create new state governments. And these new state governments have to be created with the understanding that African American men would be given the right to vote. Therefore, theoretically, these states would be more representative of the people that they actually governed within their borders. Johnson, as president, did everything he could to restrict the implementation of the Reconstruction Acts. He was effectively obstructing Congress and not carrying out his constitutional duty to enforce the law as passed by Congress. So Congress moves to have him impeached, and they do this by setting a kind of trap for him. They pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act is a law that they knew Johnson was going to violate. So what the Tenure of Office Act did was it barred the president from firing certain office holders in his cabinet unless he got Senate consent to do so. They did this because they knew that he was trying to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was responsible for carrying out the Reconstruction Acts as passed by Congress. And Johnson was going to fire him and replace him with someone who would not enforce the Reconstruction Acts. So when he fires Edwin Stanton, or I guess tries to fire Edwin Stanton, he is thus in violation of the Tenure of Office Act. He's committed a crime, and Congress will respond by impeaching him. And Johnson is the first president to ever be impeached. Now, impeachment is a two-step process. Just to be clear here really quickly. You have two houses of Congress. One house impeaches and the other house votes to remove. So you can impeach a president for any number of crimes or failing to uphold their constitutional duty, and it's the House of Representatives that votes to impeach. It's basically just voting to charge the president with a crime. If the president is charged with a crime, then the impeachment process moves to the Senate, the other House of Congress, who will hold a trial and vote to decide whether or not to remove the president from office. And that is, in fact, the only punishment for impeachment. It's just removal from office. So the House votes to impeach Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act, but when it goes to the Senate, the vote after the trial, they don't vote to remove him, but it's very close. He's saved by only a single vote. But after this is over, he's been stripped of really all political capital. No one's really willing to work with him anymore. So he has to kind of agree to abide by radical Reconstruction policies. So Johnson will step back, stop resisting Reconstruction, and radical or congressional Reconstruction will continue. Worth noting, in the next presidential election in 1868, the Republicans won't nominate Andrew Johnson again, which is kind of predictable. Instead, they will nominate Ulysses S. Grant, who was a general in the Civil War, and they will campaign against Democrats by doing something called waving the bloody shirt. This is just an expression for a tactic used by Republicans against Democrats by campaigning by saying, remember, essentially, remember the Democrats were the ones who started the Civil War. Don't give them political power. It's very effective for much of the late 1800s, which is a big part of the reason that the Republican Party holds sway in national politics for decades from here on out. The next big victory of radical Reconstruction is the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870. And very simply, this granted suffrage for African American men. So really, we've got three so-called Reconstruction amendments. You've got 13, 14, and 15. 13 and prohibited slavery. 14 made former slaves citizens and gave them equal rights. And the 15th gave all men the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. An interesting side effect of this, though, is that the women's rights movement split over support for the 15th Amendment. So some women's rights advocates supported the 15th Amendment as a kind of stepping stone to women's suffrage, whereas others, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, opposed it unless it included women. So the women's rights movement, certainly over the issue of women's suffrage, is going to split in two over this. With Susan B. Anthony famously saying, I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman. So this is a divisive issue for white women who are advocating for the right to vote. And although suffrage will remain the chief focus of the women's rights movement, it's worth noting that they also called for equal job opportunities, the right to divorce their husbands, protection against domestic violence, and access to birth control measures. Not the birth control pill, that doesn't exist until 1960, but other contraceptive devices to help them regulate when they become mothers and effectively put other things on hold, like education or career or something like that. Number three, what were the social and political effects of radical Reconstruction in the South? So first, Republican state governments in the South, for as long as they lasted, which wasn't long, passed Northern-style reforms. These Republican state governments in the South instituted public schools, new penitentiaries, asylums, and protections for African American rights. In a lot of respects, Republicans were trying to reshape the South to more resemble the North. During Reconstruction, under Republican governments, African Americans served at all levels of government, both local, state, and national government. So, for example, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were both U.S. senators for the state of Mississippi. Um, Southern whites will later claim that this era of black rule was a failure in the South, but that's really just not borne out by the data and the evidence. So, if you look at the period of time where Republicans ran Southern governments, which included many African Americans in government positions, they were able to do things like institute public schooling, penitentiaries, orphanages, insane asylums. They expanded women's rights. They expanded African American rights. They reduced crime. They reorganized governments to be more democratic. So this accusation that black rule during Reconstruction was damaging to the South is simply not true. So, Southern governments, at least until the end of Reconstruction, will be run, though, mostly by white Republicans. And they fell, as far as Democrats were concerned, they fell into two categories. They were either carpetbaggers or scalawags. Keep in mind, the South has really always been Democratic at this point. So, to be anything other than a Democrat is to be anti Southern, is to be something, or to be unsouthern, I suppose. So, you had carpetbaggers which was a derisive term for Northerners who moved south to try to take advantage of post war chaos to get into government or start up businesses or something like that. You also have so called scalawags. These are Southern whites who become Republicans. They're seen as kind of traitors to their own society. Southern Republican governments also focused on economic development. They were pursuing something that they referred to as the New South. And this implied a diversification of the Southern economy through building more railroads, investing in industry like factories, and so on. It didn't really work because most wealthy investors who would invest in this kind of thing instead focused mostly on opportunities in the West. And as a result, despite dreams of a new South, Southern states will remain largely, or I should say, relatively underdeveloped and rural when compared to their northern state counterparts. Number four, what were the main factors in both the North and the South for the abandonment of Reconstruction? Reconstruction really doesn't last that long. It's a little over a decade before we effectively abandon it as a national policy, and it's going to be incredibly damaging when we do. But keep in mind that throughout this over, like roughly a 12-year period, many Southerners opposed radical Reconstruction policies. They denounced new Republican-led governments, oftentimes alleging rampant corruption. And if you look at national politics at the time, there's fuel for this fire. So at the national level, you've got some high-profile corruption scandals that fueled this perception. You have Grant's whiskey ring scandal, in which federal agents were taking bribes for tax evasion. You also have in New York City the Tweed ring scandal, which was the Tweed ring scandal was about the political machine in New York City run by Boss Tweed of New York City's Tammany Hall. We'll talk more about that in later chapters, but in the meantime, it's probably important to understand that neither the whiskey ring scandal nor the Tweed ring scandal had anything to do with Reconstruction or Reconstruction policies, but it helped to bolster the argument that government is corrupt and thus these Reconstruction governments in the South run by Republicans are corrupt as well. Republicans in the South lost what little support they had, as many poor Southern whites who had joined the Republican Party hoping their situation would improve ultimately left when that didn't happen. So many poor Southern whites left the Republican Party when their economic situation did not improve. Plus, they were generally still opposed to rights for freed slaves, including opposing their right to vote or hold office, equal treatment under the law, etc. Reconstruction also had to go up against violent organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which emerges in this era, that made use of terrorism to try to prevent a reshaping of Southern society that would recognize the equality of former slaves. So the Ku Klux Klan targeted African Americans and white Republicans, oftentimes with the goal of discouraging them from voting. Now, fortunately, Congress will respond by passing the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871 with the intention to target and destroy the Ku Klux Klan, which they'll be pretty effective in doing, actually. And the modern day Ku Klux Klan, for what it's worth, reemerged in the 1910s and 20s, and most historians refer to it as the Second Klan because it's really a different organization because the first one had been effectively stymied by the federal government decades before. Violence against African Americans was not limited to terrorist organizations like the KKK, but we also have large race riots break out in major cities like New Orleans and Memphis, killing hundreds of African Americans in the process. Republicans are facing very stiff resistance in the South to policies that they're trying to pursue there. They're also facing pressure from within the party in northern states as well. So, as Reconstruction dragged on, Republicans and Northerners became less and less supportive of Reconstruction. Many Republicans were shifting their focus away from African American civil rights to economic expansion. They simply didn't see fighting for African American rights as a way to accomplish economic expansion. So they were looking to abandon it and shift gears to something else. And for many of them, they claimed that once the 15th Amendment was passed, which granted African American men the right to vote, that was mission accomplished. They don't need to do anything else. At this point, the problem should be able to correct itself because African Americans will vote to make society better for themselves. And it also doesn't help that the Supreme Court isn't particularly supportive of Reconstruction policies either. So the Supreme Court was central in rolling back Reconstruction's civil rights reforms. Notably, the slaughterhouse cases in 1873 narrowed the meaning and effectiveness of the 14th Amendment, which, remember, granted citizenship and equal treatment under the law. And in the process, this weakens protections for African Americans and effectively leaves civil rights policies up to the states rather than the federal government. And when you leave enforcing civil rights policies up to southern states, again, that's going to go about as well as you would expect it to. And that is especially the case as the Democratic Party gradually starts to regain control of Southern state governments, calling themselves redeemers, like they are redeeming the South from this evil era of Republican and Black rule. And as Democrats redeem or retake government in the South, they allow for violence and voter intimidation. And that prevented Republicans and African Americans who voted Republican from showing up at the polls. And when the federal government doesn't intervene, this only exacerbates the problem and accelerates the Democratic rise or resurgence to power in the South. This is all going to culminate with the Compromise of 1877. Sometimes you'll see this called the Bargain of 1877, but it's the same thing. The Compromise of 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. What happens is in 1876, the presidential election is essentially a tie. No one gets a majority of the Electoral College vote. So when that happens, the decision has to go over to the House of Representatives and they decide. When it gets to the House of Representatives, negotiations between Republicans and Democrats come to the following agreement. First, Democrats will agree to let Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes become president, but in exchange, they are essentially going to get the end of Reconstruction, which means, well, hang on. So, what they want is in exchange for the Republicans getting the White House, they want so-called home rule in the South. Home rule in the South means no further federal intervention. And this is the dawning of the so-called solid South, meaning that the South is solidly Democratic, or at least it was until the 1970s. Um, but this home rule meant that a Southerner would be appointed in the president's cabinet and that federal troops would be removed from the South. And that means that there is no longer anyone there to enforce civil rights policies and Reconstruction policies. So, with the Compromise of 1877, we had this redeeming of the South and the institution of home rule, which meant that African American rights were very quickly eroded, and segregation, racial segregation, or the Jim Crow system of segregation, will soon become the Southern norm. And it is ultimately this failure of Reconstruction, this failure to follow through on the original goals of Reconstruction, that's going to necessitate the civil rights movement decades later in the 1950s and 1960s. Because with Southern democratic home rule, the uh, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment will not be enforced and will not be upheld. And in order to make the promises of those amendments effective and a reality, it's going to take another movement and more political action later on, again, in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s.